For 500 years, the Forbidden City in Beijing stood as the ultimate symbol of imperial power, a labyrinth of gold roofs and crimson walls where the emperor, the son of heaven, ruled a quarter of the world's population. It was a place of divine hierarchy, magnificent ritual, and absolute silence. But within those silent walls lay a secret more terrifying than any war. This is not a story about military conquest, it's about domestic, cold-blooded murder. While European kings relied on public executions and the swift sword, the Chinese imperial palace perfected the art of silent elimination. The preferred method of execution for high-ranking officials and royal rivals was not the axe, but the white silk cord, a chilling ritual of strangulation that left no blood, no mark, and no scandal on the sacred marble floors. This method was the domain of a hidden, ruthless caste, the imperial eunuchs. The eunuchs, men who had sacrificed their masculinity for power, held the keys to every chamber, every secret, and every act of quiet murder. They were the emperor's silent assassins, and they used their power to execute queens, princes, and rival officials on whispered orders, often without the emperor ever knowing the full details of the carnage. The greatest secret of the Forbidden City is that the most terrifying killings were often not ordered by the emperor, but by his own mother, his chief eunuch, or a jealous concubine, all of whom acted in the shadow of the throne. Don't you dare look away. Watch this entire, deep-dive documentary, and subscribe to this channel, and you will learn the one shocking confession from a chief eunuch that reveals the hidden cemetery where the emperors buried their murdered rivals. The greatest murderer in the Forbidden City was not the emperor himself, but the very woman who was supposed to love him most, his own mother. The imperial eunuchs were the lifeblood of the Forbidden City, serving as guards, accountants, spies, and, most crucially, the direct executors of the emperor's unspoken will. They began as powerless servants, but their proximity to the inner court, the harem, granted them colossal, terrifying power. The eunuchs were the only adult males allowed near the emperor's women, making them the most trusted channel of communication, rumor, and intrigue. Their loyalty was absolute, but only to the person who could guarantee their survival and promotion, often the empress dowager or a powerful consort. The eunuchs understood the delicate nature of power. The emperor could order a death, but the eunuch had to make it happen silently and without consequence. Their weapon of choice was the white silk cord or a specially prepared poison. The cord was preferred because it was quick, left no trace of blood to pollute the sacred grounds, and symbolized the suffocating silence of the palace itself. The cruelty of the eunuchs was often magnified by their own mutilated status. They were psychologically hardened by their loss and their constant exposure to the palace's depravity. The more cruel and effective a eunuch was at carrying out a cold-blooded murder, the higher he rose in the imperial ranks. The chief eunuch, or Taijian, was often the most feared man in the empire, wielding the power of life and death over princes and ministers alike. The most horrifying ritual carried out by the eunuchs was the execution of a favorite concubine, a ritual so chilling that her body was never allowed to leave the palace walls. The harem was the central political engine of the Forbidden City, a terrifying battlefield where the stakes were not land, but succession. The hundreds of concubines and consorts were not lovers, they were rivals, each desperate for their son to become the next emperor. Their ultimate weapon was the emperor's ear. The most dangerous figure was the empress dowager, the emperor's mother. Her primary goal was to ensure the longevity of her son's reign, which often meant eliminating any potential threat, including the emperor's most capable sons from rival concubines, or even the concubines themselves. She could issue death sentences in the name of preserving stability or removing a threat to the Son of Heaven. The method of elimination was often subtle. A rival might suddenly fall ill after a dinner of poisoned tea, or be found strangled, with the official report citing suicide or natural causes. The eunuchs ensured that the paperwork was perfect and the body was disposed of immediately and silently. The most famous victims were those who committed the ultimate crime, gaining too much influence. If a concubine won too much of the emperor's affection and began to challenge the power of the empress dowager, her fate was sealed. The empress dowager would simply summon the chief eunuch and issue the fatal order, knowing the emperor would be too weak or too detached to intervene. But the most shocking murder in the Forbidden City was the death of a beautiful young queen who was found poisoned, an act that was disguised as a simple illness, until a secret medical record proved otherwise. The ritual of execution by white silk cord was the epitome of cold, calculated imperial power. It was reserved for those of high rank, ministers, nobles, and royal consorts, who were considered too prestigious to be publicly decapitated. The ritual was performed entirely in private, often in the victim's own opulent chamber. The process began when the eunuch arrived bearing the imperial edict. The victim was given a final chance to compose a letter to their family, a gesture of mercy that also served to legitimize the death as a suicide. The eunuch would then produce the thin, strong white silk cord, often reserved for this ritual. The cord was a symbolic instrument. White was the color of mourning, and silk represented the emperor's gentle, yet absolute, power. The execution itself was quick, carried out by two strong eunuchs, who ensured the neck was broken instantly to prevent prolonged suffering, and crucially, to prevent any loud screams that might carry to other parts of the Forbidden City. The body was then immediately removed. The chamber would be cleaned meticulously, and the official record would cite natural causes, often within hours of the murder. This system ensured that the vast majority of the palace inhabitants never knew a high-ranking official or a queen had been eliminated until days later, when their absence was noted. The terror lay in the silence and the speed with which one could disappear. The most barbaric act committed by the eunuchs was the final indignity paid to the murdered queen's body, a secret disposal method that erased her entire existence. The murder was only half the secret. The other half was disposal. Unlike the royal tombs, which were magnificent and permanent, the bodies of those executed in the palace were destined for a terrifying oblivion. They could not be buried in sacred imperial ground. They were criminals, regardless of their rank. Historical research points to the existence of hidden, forgotten cemeteries just outside the walls of the Forbidden City, reserved specifically for the thousands of eunuchs, palace staff, and, crucially, the murdered consorts and princes. These were simple, unmarked graves, designed to be forgotten and reclaimed by nature. The purpose was damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. For the eunuchs, the disposal of these bodies was a professional duty, a guarantee that no trace of the scandal would ever return to haunt the emperor. The bodies were often transported in the middle of the night, disguised in peasant carts, and buried quickly, ensuring their name was never carved into a stone. The absolute power of the Chinese emperor was enforced by this total control over life, death, and memory. To be murdered in the Forbidden City meant not only the end of life but the erasure of existence. This terrifying finality cemented the absolute authority of the Imperial Court. We have now traced the silent horrors from the silk cord to the unmarked graves. But the terrifying reach of the eunuchs extended far beyond the palace walls. The next 5 blocks will reveal the shocking, public rituals used to torture and execute those who defied the emperor outside the Forbidden City. While the Forbidden City perfected the art of the silent, clean murder for its elite, the emperor reserved a terrifying, drawn-out spectacle for the most grievous criminals, those who committed treason, regicide, or the assassination of a family member. This was lynching, or death by 1,000 cuts. Lynching was not merely an execution, it was a profound ritualistic annihilation of the body and soul, designed to maximize public suffering and strike absolute fear into the populace. It was the public face of the emperor's terrifying power. The condemned were stripped and tied to a wooden frame in a public square. The executioner, often a professional and highly skilled butcher, would then begin the agonizing process. The ritual was carried out over a prolonged period, sometimes hours, sometimes days, depending on the severity of the crime. The executioner used a small, razor-sharp knife to methodically remove small pieces of flesh from the body, fingers, toes, small muscle sections, in a precise, agonizing order. The intent was to keep the victim alive for as long as possible while systematically dismantling their physical form. The final, fatal cut was usually administered to the heart or throat, only after the victim had endured the maximum amount of pain. This horrifying spectacle served as a direct statement: the emperor's wrath was absolute, and those who defied him would not only die, but their body would be ritually destroyed, preventing their soul from finding peace. This ensured that the terror emanating from the Forbidden City reached every corner of the empire. But the most perverse application of Lingqi was reserved not for a political traitor, but for an innocent person whose only crime was to challenge the Empress Dowager's authority. The late Qing dynasty brought one of the most ruthless figures to ever control the Forbidden City, Empress Dowager Cixi. Cixi was a concubine who rose to become the de facto ruler of China for nearly half a century. Her power was absolute, and her cruelty was legendary, fueled by a deep-seated paranoia against any who dared challenge her authority. Cixi refined the art of silent murder, utilizing her corps of loyal eunuchs to eliminate rivals, often with chilling efficiency. One of her most famous victims was the pearl concubine, Zhenfei, the favorite of her nephew, the Guangxu emperor. The pearl concubine was ambitious and encouraged the emperor to adopt Western-style reforms, a direct threat to Cixi's conservative power. Cixi did not hesitate. During the chaos of the Boxer Rebellion, Cixi ordered her personal eunuchs to throw the pearl concubine down a well in the Forbidden City, claiming the emperor's consort should not fall into the hands of barbarians. The murder was swift, cold, and calculated, removing the only person who had the emperor's ear. This era proved that the true source of death in the Forbidden City was often not the emperor's military might, but the ruthless, political jealousy of the harem executed by the silent hands of the eunuchs. Cixi's palace was a gilded cage, ruled by her whispers and the constant fear of the well. But the most shocking fact about the vast number of eunuchs in the Forbidden City is the horrifying, surgical price they paid for their position, a ritual that often claimed the lives of the boys themselves. To gain power in the Forbidden City, men paid a price that makes the silk cord seem merciful: castration. The demand for eunuchs was enormous, sometimes reaching over 70,000 individuals serving the court at its peak. This ritual was not just a surgical procedure, it was a terrifying, high-risk entrance into the imperial system. The procedure was often carried out on young boys from poor families who needed the income. It was performed without anesthesia, by specialized cutters known as knife men, and often took place in small, private houses outside the Forbidden City. The survival rate was low, and infection was rampant. Many died during the procedure or shortly thereafter. The excised body parts were not discarded, they were meticulously preserved in lime, dried, and stored in a small jar known as the baojian, the treasure. The eunuch was required to keep this treasure for life. It was proof of his eligibility for service, and more chillingly, it was believed he needed it to be buried with him to ensure he would be reborn as a complete male in the next life. This created a profound, continuous psychological trauma. The eunuchs were a caste of men who held immense power over life and death, yet were permanently reminded of their own mutilation and broken humanity. Their cruelty in executing others was often a perverse reflection of the suffering and shame they themselves had endured. But the ultimate humiliation and control over the eunuchs was a horrifying annual event, a secret palace ritual where the emperor inspected his loyal servants in a terrifying, public manner. The emperors, acutely aware of the vast power the eunuchs wielded, were constantly looking for ways to assert their absolute dominance and prevent any eunuch from forgetting his status. This led to a disturbing, annual ritual known as the inspection of the treasure, or simply the Great Inspection. This was not a formal inspection, it was a humiliating, terrifying event designed to remind the eunuchs of their physical and political subordination. The emperor, or his appointed representative, would command a large group of eunuchs to stand before him. The goal was to ensure the eunuchs were maintaining the correct appearance and, more chillingly, that they had not attempted any form of sexual or physical reattachment that would challenge their sterile status. This public display was a masterclass in psychological control. It was an absolute assertion of the emperor's power over the eunuch's very body and identity. The memory of the knife, the shame of the mutilation, all were reinforced by this annual inspection, ensuring the eunuchs remained fiercely loyal to the system that had both mutilated them and given them power. The emperor ensured their compliance through perpetual shame. But the secrets of the Forbidden City didn't just involve murder. They involved a deeply hidden ritual used by the imperial family to poison and eliminate a rival prince in a way that was completely untraceable, the secret of the 9 dragons wine. While strangulation left no blood, poisoning offered the ultimate cover, death by illness. The imperial physicians, often coerced by the Empress Dowager, became experts in the creation of untraceable, slow-acting toxins. The most famous was the legendary 9 dragons wine. This was not a real wine, but a colloquial term for a potent, slow-acting, neurotoxin mixed with fine liquor. The poison was designed not to kill instantly, but to induce a rapid, debilitating decline, symptoms mirroring natural illness, like stroke, fever, or chronic digestive failure. The official medical records would simply conclude that the victim died of a sudden illness or excessive indulgence. This poison was typically administered to a young prince or a rival general whose popularity became too great. The official presentation was always an act of imperial favor, a gift of fine wine from the emperor. The victim, receiving the gift, was honor-bound to drink it, never knowing that the emperor's favor was a death sentence. The use of 9 dragons wine allowed the emperor to eliminate his rivals from a distance, maintaining his image as the benevolent son of heaven while his enemies quietly decayed in their own residences. The system of silent murder extended far beyond the walls of the Forbidden City, reaching into the private lives of every powerful official. We have seen the ritual executions and the poison. But the deepest, darkest secret concerns the empress who dared to bury her own child, a final act of cold, calculated survival that stunned the entire imperial court. The pressure within the harem was so extreme that it forced imperial women to commit acts that defy human understanding. One of the most chilling secrets recorded by historians concerns an empress who chose political survival over maternal love, a woman who personally oversaw the disposal of her own newborn child. In the rigid hierarchy of the Forbidden City, the birth of a prince to a low-ranking concubine or a strategically weak empress was often a death sentence for the mother. If the child was deemed a threat to the reigning Empress Dowager or the official heir, both mother and infant would be swiftly eliminated. One surviving, censored account details the fate of an empress who gave birth to a child whose timing was politically disastrous. Knowing that her powerful rival would execute both her and the baby, the empress made a cold, calculated decision. She arranged for her own infant to be secretly murdered and hastily buried within the palace grounds, allowing her to then publicly mourn the miscarriage. This terrifying act of infanticide, carried out by the mother to save her own life and maintain her political standing, was considered necessary. This secret sacrifice protected her. By eliminating the political threat herself, she proved her loyalty to the main dynastic line and survived to become a powerful Empress Dowager later in life. The harem was a place where maternal instinct was surgically removed by political necessity. But the power of the imperial eunuchs was so absolute that they often used their influence to poison the emperor's favorite women, all to maintain their own dominance over the harem. The eunuchs, though servants, were keenly aware that their power flowed not from the emperor, but from the weakness of the harem. Any consort or concubine who gained excessive affection from the emperor, or worse, challenged the chief eunuch's direct access to the emperor, was marked for silent elimination. The history of the Forbidden City is littered with accounts of sudden illnesses that befell the emperor's favorites. These were often orchestrated by the chief eunuch, who understood that an emperor heartbroken by the loss of a favorite was easier to control. The eunuchs were masters of poison, capable of mixing substances that induced symptoms indistinguishable from natural causes. The red bean poison, a slow-acting neurotoxin named innocently after a common ingredient, was a favored method. It would cause chronic fatigue, memory loss, and eventual collapse. The physician would report liver failure or consumption, and the eunuch would quietly oversee the funeral. This systemic poisoning of the emperor's inner circle proves a terrifying truth: the emperor was the son of heaven, but he was a puppet whose emotional life, and even his sexual choices, were often dictated by the murderous will of his castrated servants. The eunuchs were the true, unseen executioners of the imperial heart. But the most terrifying detail about the eunuchs' power was the secret ritual they performed on their bodies after death, a ritual they believed was necessary to escape eternal damnation. The lifelong shame and religious fear associated with castration led to one of the most bizarre and chilling rituals in Chinese imperial history, the baojian, the ritual assembly of the eunuch's body parts upon his death. We know the eunuch was required to keep his excised parts, the treasure, preserved in a jar. This treasure was the key to his afterlife. Chinese belief dictated that a person must be buried whole to ascend peacefully. Without his baojian, the eunuch was destined to wander the next world as a ghost without a body, eternally damned and incomplete. As a eunuch neared death, he would use his immense wealth to secure his treasure. The ritual involved the solemn task of a trusted colleague or family member carefully reattaching the preserved parts to the body before burial. This was a desperate, final attempt to deceive the gods and regain his lost masculinity for the next life. This ritual underscores the unimaginable psychological toll of their service. These men, who wielded the power of death over an empire, lived and died in the shadow of their own mutilation, desperately trying to undo the political sacrifice they made in their youth. The silent executioners were ultimately the victims of their own ambition. But the emperor's cruelty was not only directed at the elite. He reserved a final, terrifying ritual for the common people, a simple gesture that condemned thousands to a horrifying death. In the vastness of the Chinese Empire, the emperor's power was absolute, often extending to acts of random, terrifying violence meant solely to assert his unchallenged dominance. The emperor could condemn an entire village or city to death based on the slightest offense or simply a whim. The most chilling accounts of this absolute power involve the emperor's finger. If the emperor was angered by a local official or a general, he would often not order a formal execution. Instead, he would summon the official and, during a ceremonial audience, simply point his finger toward the door or a specific direction. This simple gesture was the sentence of death for the official and his entire family. It was silent, instantaneous, and terrifyingly arbitrary. The official would be immediately arrested by the guard and taken away for execution, often without ever knowing the precise nature of his crime. The entire court lived in fear of this silent, random judgment. This arbitrary cruelty was designed to create an environment where every citizen, no matter how powerful, understood that their life depended entirely on the emperor's unpredictable mood. It transformed the relationship between ruler and ruled into one of absolute submission and constant, paralyzing terror. We have witnessed the cold, internal and external horrors of the Chinese Empire. Now, for the final, critical verdict, we must confront the moral legacy of the Forbidden City. We have penetrated the silence of the Forbidden City, the execution by the silk cord, the surgical cruelty of the eunuchs, the poisoning by the Empress Dowager, and the final, haunting ritual of the baojian. The Chinese imperial system created an environment of perfect, institutionalized fear, where the greatest danger was often the person closest to you. The empire's stability was maintained by a hierarchy of paranoia, a system where the Son of Heaven was served by men who were physically broken and women who were morally hardened. The crown of dread in Beijing was cold, absolute, and utterly unforgiving. We have revealed the entire, horrifying truth. But now, we turn the final question to you, the crown of dread audience. The imperial eunuchs were often the most cruel and ruthless murderers in Chinese history. Do you believe their savage cruelty was a result of the psychological damage and humiliation they suffered during the castration ritual, or was it simply a natural outcome of being granted absolute, unchecked power over the lives of others? Let the world know your verdict. Drop your opinion in the comments below. Subscribe to Crown of Dread for more hidden history, and join us next time as we unearth the terrifying stories of blood and betrayal from the secret courts of medieval Europe.